uh, about anything happening toward the end here? I should mention all of you on here um, seem to be moving along pretty well with the course. As it's a graduate course, I do have the option of extending the course another semester for people to finish up work. So if you ever need time to finish up work on a course, it can be extended. It's a matter of giving people either the grade they earned to date and then changing the grade later. But for graduate, we have the option of doing that. So, but all of you are moving along pretty well. Get the major papers done. You've got them done. So, all right. Tonight I just wanted to share a few thoughts on conflict that I have. And whoops, I have to hit screen share first, don't I? Uh, a conflict is one of those interesting topics. It I find it's closely aligned with some of the things that we're talking about with power, communication, and negotiation. All those topics seem to come into play here when we're dealing with conflict. And you know, a lot of what, if you think back on what we've been trying to do this semester with the chapters, it's kind of if you're having difficulty with any of these issues, a structured way to look at them. Um, from a rational point of view, uh, but a structured way to begin to take apart the conflict. I'm going to talk about some things to think about if you're in the midst of conflict. And we did that with stress, chapter on stress. Hopefully, throughout that whole look, you have a structured way of looking at stress in your life. And so many of these things that we're talking about in here are kind of a structured way to approach looking at the various issues. One of the first things about conflict, uh, first of all, most of us don't like conflict. We tend to shy away from conflict. There are the rare few who love of shaking it up, and they all become trial lawyers. But you have to adopt an attitude that conflict is something that's inevitable. Kind of in our culture, we've always had a traditional view that conflict was something that was avoidable. If there's conflict in your organization, you're causing it, or management has made errors. Conflict is something disruptive. Management's job is to eliminate it. And for the organization to be at its best, you have to remove conflict. I think the view you have to take is conflict is inevitable. It has many causes. Many of them are rational causes. It can either contribute to or disrupt an organization. And basically, your task as a leader is to manage the conflict. And what I found an optimal level of conflict is probably important for an organization to function optimally. Basically, this little chart shows that organizational outcomes, if that conflict is moderate, it tends to have a positive. The lack of conflict is a problem, and too much conflict is a problem. What I put in here for you is a little lecture on causes of conflict and a little bit on conflict in groups and teams and some of the issues there. So that's a little a section in this module that you can look at if you want. So, positive conflict, it brings problems into the open. It can be motivational. It's where creativity happens. Most growth does not happen unless there's conflict of some sort. Conflict causes us to challenge our thinking. Um, but it can lead to negative stress and emotions. Sometimes it can hamper communication. Um, a lot of times it may cause you as a leader to avoid participative leadership because you hear conflict coming up. So um, just be aware the conflict probably is needed if an organization is going to thrive. So, in terms of looking at conflict, um, one of the um, first things to think about is if you're experiencing conflict, where is it coming from? What are some of the situational character considerations? And personalities come into play here. I'll say a little bit about that. And then a conflict management approach, which I'll talk a little bit, that styles of managing conflict. So the conflict focus, the kind of conflict that we negatively react to tends to be people focused. It's that kind of in your face confrontations where there's a lot of moral indignation and high emotions. That's the kind of conflict we tend to react negatively to. Uh, the big issue is trying to keep conflicts issue focused. Um, so, it's a difference, but, when you look at conflict, is it personal or issue related? There's a lot of causes to conflict. Um, you know, some of the organizational, um, power differentials between roles and people. If you're unsure of responsibility, if you have to rely on others to get the job done, different reward systems. These are a lot of things that happen in an organization. And then in the interpersonal, just communication, our judgments of other people, stereotyping, prejudice, holding grudges, sense of inequity or inequality. So these interpersonal ones are probably the most difficult to deal with. So the first thing, there are four main areas where we tend to see conflict happening. Uh, One is on personal differences, maybe education levels, different cultures, different values, different experiences. These all cause conflict. Uh, we all value diversity, but diversity brings with it conflict. Why? Because of all the differences. And so managing different ways people view problems, different value sets, all of that. Uh, your more diverse groups, I have found though, and however you define diversity, tends to lead to some better decisions because of the different perspectives that are coming into play. Another source of conflict in a group is misinformation or information deficiency. We don't know enough. We're misunderstanding communication. So communication is an issue. Role incompatibility. Um, in any organization, each of you kind of bring to the table different skill sets. If you're marketing skill set or finance or maybe computer technical, all of you, based on that perspective, come with different goals and that you're trying to accomplish. And these goals come in conflict. Your marketing people are always coming in conflict with production people, etc. Uh, your production people want the simplest way to get things done. Marketing people want all the bells and whistles. So there's a natural conflict there. And then finally, a lot of environmental stressors, scarce resources, those kind of things. And then again, uh, personal differences are generally a result of different backgrounds of people. The information defendants tend to be factual and clarifying information or adding information. Role incompatibility, just the differences that people bring. And a lot of times, if you're interdependent with somebody to get your job done, And then just the stress of the organization. Let me just stop here a minute. And, if you see those four areas, what would you tend to think in your organization? Where's the source of conflict coming, or conflict you guys are experiencing? Where's the source of it? Anyone want to jump in? Yeah, Christine.
Oh, for me, I don't know what you titled the second one where you don't have enough like not misinformation, but you don't have enough information.
Oh,
So I see that a lot.
just information is an interesting thing in an organization. One, we don't share enough.
Yeah.
I I believe we try and keep too many secrets. Or some people think if you communicate once, that's enough. If you have to communicate 10 times more than you think you do. So that's any others that you're currently sensing? That you're running into? Well, at the heart of it, the first step, if you're experiencing conflict, is try and look at those four areas. I think I left a handout in the folder on identifying sources of conflict. That's the first place to go. Where's this conflict coming from? Uh, and and it's important not to rush to judgment that it's all personal. Many times, as you're learning in here, differences between all of you are naturally going to lead to conflict. So if it's just differences in who you are and how you operate, that's important to know. All right, let me move on. Uh, some of the ineffective techniques for handling, just communicate your discomfort with their position of people who are expressing ideas. Don't do a lot of this in public places. Watch the expression of emotion, people getting overheated. Don't try and minimize the problem, make derogatory jokes, but all these things intuitively when they happen. So conflict management approaches, even though I'm cutting all of you a break on this week's assignment, and those that come on late week after class, I'll tell you what that is. You might want to at least take this assessment. I think this is a good assessment. They've adapted the one in the book. This is from a famous study and survey done by Thomas Kilmann. And when I did this in classes, I have always found this to be a pretty accurate determination. All of us come to the table with certain styles that we prefer. The ideal is that you could use all of these styles, and basically, these styles are if are two things happening: how cooperative should you be in a conflict, and how assertive. And you can put on a scale of cooperation and a scale of assertiveness. Uh, you could identify 5 different styles. So if you're unassertive and uncooperative, that's kind of the avoiding style. If you're unassertive and highly cooperative, you're accommodating. If you're highly cooperative, if you're highly assertive, but not cooperative, that's the forcing. And in the middle, if you give a little to get a little, that's compromising. And then collaboration is where you're trying to be 100% cooperative and 100% assertive at the same time. So let me say a little bit about each of those approaches. The competitive or forcing is a dominant. You kind of tend to approach conflict as a win-lose. You aggressively pursue what you want at the expense of others. Um, And sometimes this kind of, and all of these approaches are appropriate. What if something is so important to get done that you have no other way to be highly assertive? Um, or sometimes a very unpopular action needs to get implemented. Also, you might want to adopt this style if people use it against you all the time. You may have to adopt a much more assertive. Uh, you know, you see this all the time, kind of in war. You don't want to be, you're in a win-lose approach. In sports, you're in win-lose. So that's typically what we understand with the competitive approach. If you're using this style, be direct and use this strategy selectively because it does kind of leave a lot of disgruntled people in its wake many times. At the other end of the spectrum is the accommodation. This is when you're highly cooperative but unassertive. It's more subordinative and submissive. You neglect your own concerns to satisfy the concerns of others. So you might want to adopt this style if you're wrong, or maybe the issue isn't that important to you, and you accommodate in order to gain favor. Sometimes if there's a real status power or real power imbalance, you may be forced to accommodate. The issue is watching out if one of these styles predominates for you all the time. You know, what happens if we always seem to be accommodating, it really gets under our skin a lot. And so you got to really watch if you're using a style too much. Acknowledge the accommodation, have a rationale for it if you're using it. Avoiding, this is one where you're submissive and non-supportive, unassertive and uncooperative. You might have a criticism of managers is they always seem to avoid the issues or they're avoiding things. You don't immediately pursue things. Now, this may be appropriate. It may be appropriate. You might need a timeout period. It might be appropriate to avoid right now. But if you're constantly avoiding, it can lead to problems. The compromising, this is the notion if you're in a conflict where you try and split the pie, you each try and give a little to get a little. You really split the difference. You make concessions. The other person makes concessions. That's typically what we know with compromise. Sometimes if there's people of equal power status coming at each other, this is what the approach you see in our Congress all the time, or you're supposed to see. A lot of times compromise gives temporary solutions. Maybe you're under a time pressure. Most negotiating between, in a lot of ways, leads to compromise that's out there. And then finally is collaboration. It's dominant and supportive and assertive and collaborative. You're being entirely assertive and entirely cooperative. You attempt to work with the other person to find a solution that satisfies the concerns. Sometimes you may have heard of this as win-win negotiating, collaborative negotiating. If you're trying to learn about the other party, if the issue that you're dealing with is just too important to settle it any other way, you have to work through feelings. You're trying to gain commitment. You both become problem solvers, and you have to be willing to put yourself into the other's point of view, and they have to be willing to do that with you. You have to suspend your positions. You're trying to invent, if you're in a conflict with somebody, you're trying to invent solutions that satisfy both people. And believe it or not, collaborative approaches work more than we think they might. but they do take time. That's one of the downsides. So, which approach should you use? Here are some situational characteristics. You know, if the issue importance is high, this is when you might use some of these different approaches. The relationship, if the relationship is very important, accommodating and collaborating are two ways to build. So these four situational characteristics are all important when you're settling a conflict. So let me just stop there a minute. Anyone have any thoughts or questions on those styles? Did anyone take the survey? How'd you turn out there, Stephanie, on it? You remember? Usually we have a blend.
I came up with compromising as my highest one.
Yeah, usually, and if you take this over time, it could change too. It depends on the perspective you're answering this from. Compromise is the perfect position for a middle manager. They call it the lieutenant approach. You know, you're not the top dog, and you're not, you know, people under you, so you end up compromising a lot. Any other thoughts? All right. I'm gonna get back. Just say, you know, conflict management and negotiation are cousins. Being a good negotiator, I think you get some coverage of negotiating in both this chapter and in the power chapter a little bit. Down below, and those squares down below are conflict strategies, and talk about compromising, forcing. A negotiation strategy where you use one of those four styles is sometimes called distributive or claiming value. What claiming value means is you're trying to get as much value as you can. Distributive means you're trying to split the pie. So those are two forms of you hear when you're talking about negotiation. And then when you get to the far right, you're looking at the words you're using: collaborative conflict, or you might be talking about integrative negotiations, or creating value are words that are used. When you're in a negotiation, let's say you're buying a car, maybe, what's your orientation going in there? Is it cooperative or competitive? Or maybe you're going in to fight for some budgets for next year's budget. Are you going to be cooperative, competitive with others? And what are your goals? What concessions are you willing to make? What bottom lines do you have? And a lot of times you don't get your way if you have very high goals, make fewer or small concessions, and have a high bottom line. Sometimes a bias settlement is one side had a high goal, made small concessions, had a high bottom line. The other had a low goal, made a lot of concessions, and had a low bottom line. So sometimes they're lopsided, like when Philadelphia used to negotiate with all its unions years ago. And then a middle ground settlement. So the goals you go into, time limits, the role of the constituencies, and the personal negotiating style, they're all factors that enter into negotiation. So what are your goals going in? How much time do you have? What's your role? And what's your style? All plays a factor there. So the fundamental dilemma you have is, do you want to try and create value, win-win, collaborate? You want to try and have winners for everyone? Or are you taking a bargaining stance? When we talk about bargaining, we're talking about a more distributive stance. You're going to try and get as much of your position as you want. And, bargaining is a lot of a mixed motive game. That's what we do when we're buying a house, buying a car. There's different preferences on that agreement. And what one person does affects the other. And when two people come together, each want to try and predict what the other is going to do without being predicted yourself. So the more person A can control person B's level of uncertainty, the more powerful you are. It involves judicious use of threats, and they only work if they're credible. And so, at times you'll see people in conflict threatening each other. So choosing a style, some things you need to ask yourself: how much opportunity is there for win-win? Another big thing people forget about when they're in conflict: do we have to work together in the future? So how important is it to maintain a relationship? If all will be much better with an agreement, it makes sense to try and create value or go for win-win. A lot of the value claiming tactics may leave anger and mistrust. And then if you get a reputation out there for manipulation or self-interest, it's going to be difficult in the future for you to build networks and coalitions. So you have to watch how you deal with your conflict management. I like this paragraph. It said, when negotiators must work together over time, the strategy of conditional openness is most effective. This strategy tells the negotiator to start with an open and collaborative behavior and to maintain this approach if the other party does too. If the other party becomes adversarial, however, the negotiator should respond in kind and remain adversarial until the opponent makes a collaborative move. I kind of like that suggestion. Go into it with this conditional openness. You're going to try and win-win as long as the other person is too. And get into ethics in all of this. Are you following rules that are understood and acceptable? Are you comfortable discussing and defending your action? There's a lot of bluffing and lying a lot of times that go on in negotiations. Would you want someone to do it to you? So I want to. I'm just going to end up by talking. There's a book out there that I would highly recommend. It's called Getting to Yes, Getting to YES by Ury, URY. It's been out there for a lot of years. In fact, it came out of Harvard Negotiation Institute, and it really was the model for what was behind Jimmy Carter's that agreement between Israel and Egypt. And it's called interest-oriented negotiating. And here are some of the principles on the collaborative principles behind it. A lot of people, when they come into negotiating, come in with a position. And usually we have positional bargaining. Like you go into your boss and say, if I don't get a $10,000 raise, I'm quitting. That's a positional bargaining tool. And if you don't get the 10,000, you leave. But that position has a lot of underlying things. There's an underlying issue behind that position. The underlying issue is maybe your compensation. And then lying below that issue is an interest. What's your interest behind that? Maybe your interest is a feeling that I'm being paid what I'm worth, or etc. But what happens a lot with negotiating, we start with a position. And if people can't move off a position, then there's very little room to work together. So this interest-oriented negotiation, it focuses on interest, not positions. You by switching the focus more to interest or underlying issues, you allow collaboration between parties that is more likely to produce a favorable result. That's what Israel and Egypt were able to get at. They each had positions on land, but the negotiation really got them behind what's your underlying interest? Can we deal with that? Invent options for mutual gain. Instead of focusing on winning a negotiation, which often leads to poor business or personal relations, focus on improving the situation for all parties. Work toward the Pareto efficiency, working toward the optimal solution. In other words, can we get this done efficiently and effectively? Work toward the optimum solution. Working toward the optimum can help reach a more favorable outcome for the current negotiation. Establish overarching shared goals. Set goals at the beginning that help frame. You could set a goal that when we leave this negotiation, we're going to have a good relationship. Or you could set a goal that we want to be efficient about this. We don't want to waste money. Most union management disputes that happen in organizations, a lot of money gets lost. They're not very efficient or effective. Use objective criteria. Stay away from opinion. So it's easy to take negotiations personally. So having objective measures can help people not reject good agreements without thought. Discuss success in terms of real gains and not imaginary losses. And I think what I did is, I put some notes in for you on interest-oriented negotiation. So does anyone have any questions? Any thoughts on this tonight? I know I was doing all the talking.
I think the strategies for handling conflict was very helpful. I did the conflict score test as well, and I wasn't surprised by where it landed me. I feel like I'm more accommodating. I'm trying to, please everybody. So when I got my results, that wasn't surprising to me. But I kind of scored there and integrating and collaborative. So,
the part of it is, the model ideally would say is how can you move toward using all of these styles out there, and sometimes your position forces you into certain ways of acting too.
Yeah, and who you're dealing with, I think, is a big part of that as well.
All right. Anything else anyone has?